Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. This is the first edition of ScoutSA's Virtual Classroom. We're starting off this series with the topic of San Antonio's architectural history. I'm glad that you could join me today. This is actually a re-recording of the original session. We had some technical difficulties and weren't able to fully record the first attempt at this, so I hope you enjoy this second edition. I am Dr. Jenny Hay. I'm the ScoutSA Program Manager at the City of San Antonio's Office of Historic Preservation. I'll be leading this webinar today, and next week my colleague Jessica Anderson will join me as we continue our series of these virtual classroom courses for you, and we'll cover the topic of how to discover the history of your home. So I hope you'll tune in for that episode as well. And if you're watching this later, you will be able to find both recordings on our website. So check ScoutSA.com if you're interested in either of these. All right, so I'm going to turn off my video and we'll get started with today's presentation. So just a quick outline of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Office of Historic Preservation for those of you who are joining us and maybe joining an event with OHP for the first time, to give you just a little bit of background on who we are and what we do. I'll introduce historic districts from a broad sort of American history perspective to help you get oriented and figure out how we got here. I will give a little bit of information about the development history of San Antonio and answer the question, what's so special about 1877? And then we'll jump into some style spotlights, looking at the most common architectural styles here in San Antonio. So we are the Office of Historic Preservation. We are a standalone department within the city's organization. We support the Historic and Design Review Commission, which is a public board that considers designations and work on designated properties in the city of San Antonio. We have about 20 full-time employees, so we're fairly large. There's a good reason for that. We review about a third of the requests for work on historic properties in the state of Texas, so we stay very busy. We have a number of divisions that fall underneath the department. We have an archaeology division, we have a design review team, so that's the team that takes in applications and helps folks move through the process to get their work approved and permitted on historic properties. We have a living heritage program. We have the ScoutSA program, that's the survey and designation program, and of course that's who's leading these virtual classrooms during Preservation Month 2020. And finally, we have a vacant buildings program, which is a pretty innovative program that essentially creates a registry for vacant structures in San Antonio that contribute to our character and essentially asks them to be held to a high standard so that we are keeping our built environment in good shape and then also moving properties back into use wherever possible. The mission of the Office of Historic Preservation is to preserve the cultural, economic, and environmental sustainability of our city. And so that may be a little bit broader than you might have anticipated for a preservation office. We take our work very seriously. And as you can see in this picture, we know that our work doesn't just stop with moving approvals and permits through the public hearing process. A huge portion of what we do is education and outreach, so public engagement opportunities. Actually, what you see, the photo that you see on the screen is a picture of our one of our window workshops, which is one of our most popular hands-on training programs. And those are folks who just finished a weekend learning how to restore wood windows, and you can see some of their work there in the background. That property is the Kelso House Learning Lab. It's a property owned by a nonprofit we have a partnership with called the Power of Preservation Foundation. And so those students were able to come and learn by taking wood windows and taking them apart and putting them back together again, and then reinstalling them there in that house. So clearly that house is a work in progress. All of the work is being done by students and volunteers and contractors who are helping us. This is all powered through donations that come through the Power of Preservation Foundation. So that's just one example of the kind of work that we do, the kind of educational training that we offer. I encourage you, if you are interested in attending one of those, you should check out our website. You can find us at sapreservation.com, and we list all of our events. For the time being, a lot of them are virtual, but that doesn't mean they've stopped. We actually have a hands-on window workshop, a virtual hands-on, I suppose, in just the next couple of weeks. So do check that out if that's something you think you might be interested in. So let's get started today with our topic. I wanted to give you kind of a broad understanding of where historic districts in the United States started. So it's a uniquely American experience, the way that we preserve sites as districts. And it's important to look back on kind of the traditions that brought us here. In the 1920s, Americans were beginning to more freely move about the country, if you will, because of their access to automobiles. And so, of course, folks with the means to travel were traveling more, and there was a renewed interest in sort of learning and taking your family to learn about the history of our country. And at this time, there were a couple of very important characters who made investments into spaces that ultimately became sort of models for how we think about historic districts in our country. So many of you may be familiar with Colonial Williamsburg. That project was actually funded by the Rockefeller family. It's an endowment that I think something like $100 million came from the Rockefeller family in order to preserve those structures. So beginning in the 1920s, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had been approached by a preacher who was the preacher for a church within Williamsburg, still an active parish, who knew that this area was going to need some help and had the connections to make that happen. And so slowly but surely, initially as sort of a secretive investment project, but then later a more public project, Rockefeller began acquiring and partnering with folks to acquire the historic properties within Colonial Williamsburg, and then again to begin investing in them so that they could be restored. Another example of a sort of prototype historic district is Greenfield Village in Dearborn. So Henry Ford, of course, in the 1920s was certainly able financially to make investments in whatever he wanted to. And so he chose to start a collection actually of historic structures from across the country, and he either relocated them or reconstructed them beginning in the 1920s in Greenfield Village, which is now part of the Ford Museum there in Dearborn. This really started in the early 1920s. The first buildings kind of got there in late 1920s, 1928, and then the Greenfield Village actually formally opened in 1933. So some of the structures that you can see at Greenfield Village are the courtroom, actually a full courthouse where Abraham Lincoln practiced law, Thomas Edison's laboratory, and the home of the Wright brothers. So you can kind of get an idea of what Ford was looking for, right? Early innovators, early American innovators, and the spaces that were important parts of their stories. What's interesting here is that he didn't preserve them in their original sites. He was picking them up and moving them into what we might today call a sort of petting zoo of historic buildings. So by and large, that particular tradition has sort of fallen out of favor in preservation. You can still find some good examples of this petting zoo sort of model. There's even one pretty close to us called Pioneer Village in Gonzales, where there's a number of historic structures there related to Texas history that have been moved to a single location. Again, it just is sort of lays the foundation for how Americans are thinking about preserving our historic spaces. So even earlier than these two models that I mentioned, preservationists were starting to get organized and thinking about ways to save the spaces that were important to them. So prior to about the 1920s, starting at about the turn of the century, a little bit earlier, most preservation projects were focused around single sites that were associated with American patriots. So Mount Vernon is an excellent example of this, where a group of wealthy women were able to come together and work to save the home of George Washington, which of course has a very particular role. It's incredibly important in the story of America, and other spaces were receiving that same treatment. Here in Texas, of course, at the turn of the century, the Alamo was a space that was hotly contested what the future was going to be. We had characters like Adina de Zavala and Clara Driscoll who were coming together in different ways to try to protect that space, which of course was associated with the beginnings of Texas as we know it. And there were additionally a number of other groups who I think were organizing at the same time. Some of them sort of moved in the same circles. So in 1924 in San Antonio, the city was doing a lot of street widening in relation both to accommodating cars and streetcars, and then also in working to mitigate flood risk downtown. One of the structures that was threatened by this street improvement project was the Market House, which was built in the late 1850s. You can see it there at the left of your screen. It's that Greek Revival facade there. And they, the city, of course, needed to remove the building in order to widen the street. And a group of women who eventually would become the San Antonio Conservation Society organized to try to prevent the loss of that structure. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful. They did secure something of a compromise by having the city build basically a replica in San Pedro Springs Park, which is now the Playhouse Theater, which looks almost identical in its front facade to what you see there on the screen. But of course, that was only the very beginning for the San Antonio Conservation Society. They're still a very active organization today, and throughout their history, they've worked to save structures and advocate for the history of San Antonio. I will also mention New Orleans, because about the same time in New Orleans, 1924, 1925, there was a group of preservationists who became organized and formed the Victorian Commission, so the Old Quarter Commission, there to save what we know today as the French Quarter. There were a couple of threats that sort of spurred them on to form the commission. One of them is what you see there in the center photo, is the Beauregard House. So General Beauregard was a renowned local sort of hero of the Civil War. He was a Confederate general who was from New Orleans and ended up, I believe, dying of yellow fever in New Orleans sort of tragically after the war. So his home there was threatened in about 1925, I think, by future development, which sort of seems laughable now, but they wanted to build a macaroni factory on that site. And the group of preservation advocates that were part of the Victorian Commission came together to actually raise the funds to purchase the property and save it. It's still there today, across from the Ursuline Convent, which is one of the only sort of remnants of French architecture that you can see in the French Quarter today. There were additional threats, and eventually the Victorian Commission worked with the state legislature to pass enabling legislation for the creation of historic districts. Although the city recognized the French Quarter as a historic district in the 1920s, it wasn't until the 1930s that state legislation actually enabled that protection to be put into place. So in reality, it was Charleston who was the first city to come together and actually formally recognize and protect a historic district in sort of the way that we know it today. So in Charleston, their creation, what they called an old and historic district, was actually sort of a public-private partnership. So the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings worked with the city together to create sort of a managed space in this historic district there within the city. It wasn't until much later that the federal government sort of caught up in how we were thinking about these historic districts locally. So just to give you some quick background about federal legislation, so of course we had the Antiquities Act in 1906, which enabled the creation of national monuments. The National Park Service was established in 1916, and their purview was of course parks, cemeteries, and monuments. I will say that cemeteries, battlefields, and war monuments, still some of those were managed by the War Department, but over the years, more and more of them were moved over into the purview of the National Park Service. In the 1930s, as part of Roosevelt's New Deal, the Works Progress Administration funded a survey called the Historic American Buildings Survey. This is a nationwide survey, put architects back to work across the country, and their job was specifically to seek out historic structures and document them. Their photographs and drawings are archived in the Library of Congress. We have a number of structures in San Antonio that are no longer extant that were recorded by the Historic American Buildings Survey. So if you were interested in seeing some really interesting and very detailed drawings and photographs of old San Antonio, I would encourage you to check out the Library of Congress. Most, if not all, of that collection has been digitized. It's a wonderful resource. And then finally, the National Historic Preservation Act was signed in 1966 by President Johnson. The National Historic Preservation Act did a number of things. What I'm going to talk about today specifically is its creation of the National Register of Historic Places. So the National Register of Historic Places is just what it sounds like. It's a list of significant spaces in America. You can list individual locations as landmarks or a collection of spaces as a historic district. So this is the first time at the federal level that we were recognizing groups of buildings together in a way that would preserve them and recognize their significance. It is important to note, and I'll cover this more in our next slide, that the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Register of Historic Places, the intent, of course, is to recognize those spaces that are significant to our country, but also to protect them from harm, specifically harm from the federal government. So what the National Register of Historic Places does is it would require, if federal funding were used to do work or a project that affects a site or a district that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, then there would be a specific process in place to review that work to make sure that any harm to a historic place is mitigated as much as possible. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that a private owner, a property owner, could not do anything that they wanted to the site. They would not be required to go through any kind of a review process from listing on the National Register unless they were claiming a tax credit to do so. That would pull in federal purview and thus state review from the State Historic Preservation Office. But otherwise, private property owners with property listed on the National Register of Historic Places are still able to do anything they like with their property. Local historic districts are a little bit of a different animal. So they are based on local criteria. So we define what we think is a historic district locally. It's a local decision. So there's a public hearing process that's put in place by our Unified Development Code. And this is true across the country. Local historic districts provide the highest level of protection to our historic structures in neighborhoods because they can require design review and demolition review, where the National Register of Historic Places cannot require that. There are guidelines here in San Antonio. We have historic design guidelines that projects must follow. Those guidelines can be citywide or they can be district specific. We have both here in San Antonio. We have citywide historic design guidelines that all of our historic districts and landmarks have to follow. We also have district specific guidelines for Brooks School of Medicine there on the south side of town, and we also have the Mission Historic District Design Manual, which is a set of district-specific guidelines for the Mission Historic District, which stretches along the San Antonio River, starting in about Roosevelt Park and goes all the way down to our southernmost mission. Local historic districts are a zoning change. It's enabled by state law, and in San Antonio, this means that you gain access to local tax credits. So for new historic districts, there's an automatic tax credit for owner-occupied structures. So if you live in your house and your house is part of a new historic district for up to 15 years, you can have a little bit of break on your local city taxes. We also have what's called a substantial rehabilitation tax credit for folks who are reinvesting in historic properties, whether it's a property that they live in or a commercial property. It doesn't make a difference. They can get a little bit of a boost, if you will, a little bit of a tax break by reinvesting and extending the life of our historic neighborhoods. So let's pivot for a second to the development history of San Antonio. I want to introduce to you San Antonio in the 1870s before the railroad arrived here. And what you're looking at is a bird's eye view map of the city in 1873. This actually faces to the south here. San Antonio was very much a border city at this time. So a border in the sense that we were on the edge of American expansion westward. At this time, we were sort of the largest city other than San Francisco that was west of the Mississippi River. We also are very much a border if you think about the environment. San Antonio actually, and Bexar County in general, is kind of an interesting place if you think about the landscape. The northern sort of third of Bexar County is part of the Edwards Plateau. It's what we call the hill country, so it's rocky and drier, a lot of perforated limestone there that you can see sort of breaking up through the landscape. And then as you sort of travel south into the center of the county, so sort of where downtown is located, you enter this swath of blackland prairie, which is an incredibly fertile area with clay soils. You can have really great croplands here, which would explain why we were sort of a hub regionally for having crops available, and also because of that clay and the soil types that were common in the blackland prairie, it is an area that is very vulnerable to erosion. And this is incredibly important because if you think about our climate and the sort of patterns of precipitation that we have here in San Antonio, you can understand pretty quickly that that would present a pretty dramatic problem because we are prone to very heavy precipitation events. So it rains a whole lot in a short period of time, which causes some pretty serious flash flooding. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute, and what our city has done and why that's affected our built environment. So in 1870, I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of what was happening around Texas and why San Antonio was an important part of the Texas story during this time. So you can see that the cities of Dallas and Austin were pretty small. Houston was growing, had almost 10,000 people. San Antonio was the second largest city in the state with a population of about 12,000. And Galveston, which of course was a major port city at this time, had about 14,000 people. I will point out that even in the 1850s, San San Antonio had attempted to get a railroad to come to the city, and the city and the county together had invested a huge amount of money. Actually, together it was $100,000 in a railroad company that would have brought lines both from Indianola, which, if you know anything about Texas history, Indianola was the second biggest port to Galveston, down the coast a little bit towards Corpus Christi, not quite that far. Indianola was washed away about 1900, I think maybe a little bit later, by a large hurricane. And then the other rail line would have come from Port Lavaca, which was really just very close to Indianola, just down the coast, but again, a very important port city where goods and people were coming into the state. And that would have, of course, brought folks up to San Antonio, but 1850 might have been a fine time to make that investment, but by about 1860, the climate had changed quite a bit, you can imagine, and as we were headed toward the Civil War, that company didn't last, and so those rail lines actually did not come as anticipated, and that money was lost. So in 1877, the first rail line arrived in San Antonio, which is a very important moment for us. Within the next about 5 years, we had a second rail line, and there was rapid expansion of rail lines during this time. Railroads were important for a variety of reasons, and not the first of which is that it brings people to the city. But in addition to people, people bring their ideas, so it brings influence from the architectural styles from across the country. In San Antonio in particular, it actually brought the military back to our city. So during that sort of moment, before San Antonio had been able to get the railroad to come to them, the federal government had moved sort of preemptively their military bases, their focus up to Austin, which of course was going to be the state capital, and so there were a variety of reasons that seemed like the most important place to invest in having a military presence. But once the railroad came back to San Antonio, so did the military, and it was at this time that Fort Sam Houston really started to expand very rapidly. By 1890, you can see that our population had nearly tripled. We had, again, the second largest city in the state. I will say that I think that 200 people is a small number to quibble over with Dallas there. So we were a very large, very important city if you think about it regionally. The other thing that the railroad brought to San Antonio was material goods. So this is why the railroad is particularly important to the built environment, to our historic neighborhoods, because they made, the railroad made possible bringing in machine-produced materials from across the country in a way that was suddenly affordable. So prior to this, you would have had to build houses with local materials unless you were incredibly wealthy and able to pay for them to be transported over hundreds or thousands of miles. So properties were, wood was locally sourced rather. We had stone from local quarries. So a number of the stone buildings in San Antonio, most of them would date to prior to the railroad, or if they dated to after the railroad, you could anticipate that they might have had stone from outside of the city coming in on those train cars. So all in all, I think that you can see, I'm going to scoot back to the previous slide here, I think you can kind of see the importance of that railroad. This is 1873 to 1890 is really not that big of a time, but to jump from 12,000 to almost 38,000 people is an enormous jump, and you can also see just the scale of the development. This map from 1890 shows the platted neighborhoods. It doesn't mean that all of the houses in these sort of shaded spaces were built, but it does mean that all of those areas were open for development, for residential development. One other thing that I wanted to point out, and I'll jump back over to this slide, is how important water was to San Antonio, and our city really holds on to the historic development pattern that was in place because of our Spanish colonial history. So what you can see in this in this picture here, in this bird's eye view map, if you will, is not only the importance of our river, and I'm going to highlight here, I'm going to draw over what we call the Great Bend, which is sort of the historic part of the Riverwalk today that goes through downtown, but also San Pedro Creek, which I'm outlining here, that stretches in from the west and heads south. And then also these really interesting features here. So this waterway that's running parallel there to San Pedro Creek, and there's another couple of them here. You can kind of see them stretch out on the east side of town here. These are called acequias. So acequias are essentially irrigation ditches that were a tradition that the Spanish colonial residents brought to us, of course, when they arrived in the 18th century, and they are still sort of visible in the landscape today. So even in 1873 and even today, there are sort of vestiges of these acequias throughout town. So they were very important, as you can see, to the cropland. I'm going to just kind of highlight these orchards that you can see here, both along the river and then out as you get farther out along the acequia out of town. So they provided water for people, for crops, for our stock. So one of the most common questions that I get about acequias is, are there any still today? You know, they do exist as archaeological deposits, if you will, throughout the city, but there are working acequias. If you go to the National Park Service's locations at the missions on the south side of town, they actually have a working acequia that provides irrigation to active crop fields. It's a really fascinating thing to see. So I would encourage you, I believe it's in Mission San Juan, to go and take a look at that when you are able to. So the big difference here, of course, is that the sort of grid system that we had was built around the Spanish colonial pattern of plazas and acequias, and then by 1890 we've become this true American city as we expand in almost all directions in these new grid patterns that you see here. We remain the biggest city in Texas from 1910 until through 1920, and this is a huge time of growth. And this map that you see on the right side of your screen is from 1924. All of these areas by this time had filled in and were continuing to fill in with residential structures. So our neighborhoods in the 1920s were really just exploding around the city. There was, at this time, because of obviously the increase of population and investment in the built environment, the flood risk became untenable. So in 1921, we had a catastrophic flood which caused hundreds and probably thousands of people to lose their lives throughout the city, and led directly to the construction of Olmos Dam, which is on the north side of downtown, in 1926. The Olmos Dam protected the downtown area from catastrophic flooding, but did not necessarily protect other parts of town, specifically the west side of town, which is full of creeks that drain into the San Antonio River. And so while downtown in some ways was sort of getting this new protection, there were other parts of the city where there were was densely populated, full of homes that were still at great threat to these catastrophic floods. So before we jump into our discussion of historic districts, I'll just mention, I'll go back to this slide, I'll just mention that by the end of the 1920s, of course, the start of the Great Depression began to affect Texas, and San Antonio was no exception. The Depression took hold a little bit later than in other places. Again, this is because of our unique geography. They're in the center of the country. Things are a little slower coming to us. That was the case for the Great Depression, for better or worse. But it did take hold here and have a serious impact on growth within the city. And that's very visible in our built environment. So downtown especially, you can see that there were a number of of our largest historic buildings that came online in 1929. The Tower Life building is one of those in 1930, but by about 1931, things had slowed because there just wasn't money available for the expansion that we had seen in the 1920s. So let's talk about what our historic districts today preserve across the city. So we have 31 local historic districts. We actually have one pending application right now for a historic district on the west side called Rinconcito along Guadalupe Street at South Colorado. We had in San Antonio the first residential historic district in the state, which was the King William Historic District. That was established in 1968. Our most recent historic district here in San Antonio is Green Lawn Estates. That was established in 2019. I'm going to highlight Green Lawn Estates for you. It's at the northwest corner of this map. Maybe a little difficult to see with that color. Let's try a different one. Let's try pink. So it's right up here. So Green Lawn Estates is, again, our most recent. The last few historic districts that we've had established in San Antonio have been relatively small. Green Lawn Estates, I think, had something like 40 properties. We also had, I'm going to highlight here, sort of in the north central portion of San Antonio, the East French Place Historic District, which is a small, I think, fewer than 40 properties. We had the West Fort Historic District, which is just between Fort Sam Houston and Broadway near Breckenridge Park. That had fewer than 70 properties in it. And then the Nathan Historic District, which is just to the west of the King William Historic District. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. Was also a recent one of our recent designations, and they had fewer than 70 properties as well. So there's a trend, I think, nationwide to establish smaller historic districts. That's certainly been the case here in San Antonio. Our largest historic district is Mission with over 1,600 parcels. So this is just a portion of Mission here. It actually heads farther south pretty dramatically to extend, like I said, to our southernmost Mission. And our smallest is Woodlawn Lake. And that's, of course, not in acreage, but in number of parcels. And that's located here on the west side. Okay, so I'm going to introduce five architectural styles that are the most commonly seen in San Antonio. I'm just going to do a quick overview of each of them and then direct you to some resources where you can learn more if you'd like. So the first that I want to introduce today is Folk Victorian. So this is the most common style of Victorian era architecture that we see in San Antonio. It is often one story, although it can be two-story. The vast majority of Folk Victorian homes are single-story. They're simplified forms. They're rectangular or L-shaped. L-shaped, I think, are the most common. So we have here what we call a gable and wing roof form. So we have the wing that stretches out, if you see my cursor on the bottom left of your screen, and the gable that stretches out to the front. And you can see that on the photo at the top left as well. Here's the wing, and here's that gable there at the front. If you see this form, you are probably looking at a folk Victorian home. Of course, it's the detailing that makes it Victorian. You can have a folk national house without the Victorian influence, but all of these structures that you're seeing here have some level of Victorian styling applied to them. So all of these homes would have had porches. Of course, this is long before the era of air conditioning, and so porches provided a very important space where people could spend time and cool off. Additionally, all of these wood windowed homes would have taken advantage of dominant winds, right? Would have constantly been open to move air through the houses. It's a little different than we think about homes today, of course, with air conditioners. And then in several of these examples, you can see that there are some decorative elements applied to the home. So you can see some spindlework porch detailing. I'm going to highlight that here at the bottom right, and then again at the top right, and decorative brackets. Some turned columns. You can see on the bottom left there's a turned column there, as well as in several of the other examples. The historic districts that feature folk Victorian architecture are the Nathan Historic District, largely. We have some folk Victorian in the Dignowity Hill Historic District and also in our Lavaca Historic District. So these are the areas that are very close to downtown. Some of our oldest homes, our oldest neighborhoods in the central part of our city would have featured this style of architecture. By about 1910, folk Victorian had fallen out of style, and we'll cover what sort of took its place as the styled mode in just a minute. So related to folk Victorian, also within that Victorian era, was the Queen Anne style. So at the same time that we were seeing folk Victorian homes, we were seeing Queen Anne homes built. These would have indicated that the person was of higher means, a little bit better off, rather than maybe a skilled worker. You would have had a business professional of some sort. You can tell Queen Anne homes by their asymmetrical massing, their irregular and steeply pitched roof shapes. I think these are all really good examples of that. The main difference between Queen Anne and folk Victorian, if you're really struggling to identify, would be the roof form. So I'm going to highlight here the hipped roof form on the bottom two examples. So if you were looking at a folk Victorian, you would have seen that wing stretching out parallel to the street. On a Queen Anne home, you're going to see a hipped roof form instead of that wing. I hope that that's clear to everyone. Additionally, you're going to see decorative elements such as turrets and bay windows. We've got some great examples of those on the photos on the right side. Again, decorative railing and brackets, more intense decoration typically on Queen Anne homes than on the folk Victorian. So we would have even seen things like patterned shingles that would create textured wall surfaces, and you can see that here in the pediment of this gable, that there were some patterned shingles laid as a very nice decorative element here. Queen Anne homes are found, again, across the city. We've got a lot of them, again, in Lavaca in the Dignowity Hill Historic District. There are a few of them within the Nathan Historic District. The photo at the top right is actually from Woodlawn Avenue, just north of Woodlawn Lake there. That one is located within the Monticello Park Historic District. Okay, next, let's talk about Craftsman homes. So Craftsman architecture is from the arts and crafts movement, which started across the pond, if you will, and came to the United States in the early 20th century. Craftsman architecture is a sort of blatant rejection of the Victorian style, the Victorian era. So the sort of prim, proper influence of the Victorian era was rejected, and the sort of hand-hewn, hand-built, skilled craft work became a popular way of designing homes. So Craftsman homes are seen in San Antonio beginning in about 1905 and through 1930, although you can see Craftsman influence through the later 1930s as well. Craftsman homes feature a low-pitched gabled roof. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that. This bottom right photo is an excellent example. So you've got this very low, not very steep at all, these low-pitched roof lines here. They have often exposed rafters, so I'm going to circle down on the top left what exposed rafters look like underneath that eave. They also often have knee braces, so I'll circle a knee brace on the top right here. Also a very common element in Craftsman architecture. They have wide front porches that make a dominant statement. So each of these homes has an excellent example, I think, of the style of front porches that are most common on Craftsman homes here in San Antonio. The columns that supported the porches are typically square topped with these supports that have sloping sides. We call those tapered or battered columns. I'm going to, in the bottom left corner, I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So they're sort of sloped on the sides here, so those columns would be called tapered or battered. And the Craftsman style is typically associated with the bungalow form. That was a very popular housing form across the country and especially in San Antonio during this time. Craftsman homes can be seen in a number of our historic districts and in a number of our older neighborhoods that aren't necessarily protected as historic districts. So spaces like Beacon Hill and Alta Vista and Highland Park and Denver Heights are full of Craftsman homes. Nob Hill is a historic district on the east side that is almost exclusively Craftsman, a really lovely collection of homes that were built in about the 1910s, 1920s. Featuring details similar to the ones that you're looking at on your screen right now. All right, we're going to jump into one of the revival styles now. Tudor Revival, you could call these storybook cottages if you wanted to. Tudor Revival was popular about the same time as Craftsman style homes, although it's a little bit more dominant, a little longer lasting in our legacy neighborhoods here locally. So you will see a cross gable on the front facade. I'm going to use my cursor to point out what a cross gable is. It's most easily seen from an aerial view, but when you have this roof line that moves parallel to the street, and then the front gable forms another line that moves perpendicular to the street to create a cross. Let's see, probably best seen on the bottom left photo here. We have this roof line that runs parallel to the street that is intersected again by that gable. So if you were looking at it from an aerial perspective, it would sort of resemble a cross shape. They have steeply pitched roofs. All of these are excellent examples of how steeply pitched the roofs would be in Tudor Revival style. They often featured half timber detailing. Several of these homes do. I'm going to point it out on the top right here, this half timber detailing in the front gable there. Massive chimneys are typical. At the bottom right, we have a particularly massive chimney that you can see I'm tracing out with my cursor now. They often feature arched entries and tall, narrow windows. Those windows in many cases have stained glass in them, and that is still intact today in some of our historic districts. The historic district that comes to mind, I think, most easily when talking about Tudor Revival architecture is Monticello Park, just off of Fredericksburg Road, northwest of downtown. And then finally, a style that is, I think, commonly associated with San Antonio, but actually didn't become popular until about 1915. Spanish Eclectic style. So Spanish Eclectic homes feature low-pitched or flat roofs. You can see that on each of these examples here. Little or no overhang of the eaves. Like Tudor Revival, they also featured arched doors and windows, although you'll see they're not quite as narrow, and the doors don't necessarily have that sort of foyer effect necessarily that the Tudor Revival arches sometimes create. They feature red tile roofs and stucco exteriors most of the time, although that is not 100% of the time. You can have other materials, including brick, present in Spanish Eclectic style homes. I will also say that it's sometimes confusing because red tile roofs appear both in Spanish Eclectic architecture as well as in Mission Revival architecture. So there's a quick tell for if you're looking at Mission Revival versus Spanish Eclectic, and it's the presence of a parapet roof. I'm going to draw on the top left picture here what a parapet roof that a mission revival style home would feature. It would look sort of like a mission on the top of the roof line there. I apologize for my poor art skills with the cursor, but if you see a roof line that resembles a mission, you're looking at Mission Revival, but without that roof line there, it's probably Spanish Eclectic, even though they both may feature those same materials, the red tile roof and the stucco exterior. Okay, if you want to know more about architectural styles in San Antonio and beyond, let me suggest this resource for you. It's called A Field Guide to American Houses. There's actually a very nice revised edition that was published in 2015. You can get this as an ebook for less than $10. I highly recommend if you're interested in this at all. It is a wonderful resource for architectural historians. It was written by Virginia McAllister, who actually just recently passed away. She was a preservationist from Dallas. And within this book, there are dozens and dozens of examples of each style and many more than I covered here today. Many of those examples and almost every style include photos from San Antonio. So we are well represented. So I think if you are at all interested in this and would like more information, this is exactly what I would recommend to you. Okay, so that is the conclusion of our first edition of the ScoutSA Virtual Classroom. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you don't mind that I had to re-record. Thanks for putting up with our technical difficulties. If you have any interest in this, let me suggest that you sign up for our next event, which will take place on Thursday, May 14th. This is part of our Preservation Month 2020 celebration. We'll be covering the sort of methodology, research methodology of the ScoutSA team, and we will teach you how to discover the story of your own home with a special focus on the resources that are available electronically. So right now we're in a time where it's really difficult to physically access local archives and libraries. Fortunately, there's a lot that's available to us online, much of it at no cost. And so we will help you get familiar with those primary sources and learn how to navigate them as you conduct your own research projects on historic sites that are important to you. So thank you again. I encourage you to check out the rest of our Preservation Month calendar at sapreservationmonth.com and our other ScoutSA related resources at scoutsa.com. And thank you again for tuning in.